I'm going to tell you something tonight that will make you sick to your stomach. Not because it's violent, not because it's vulgar, but because you're going to recognize yourself in it. And when you do, you're going to want to turn this off. Close the screen. Tell yourself this old woman doesn't know what she's talking about. But there is one secret I learned at the cost of $1.2 million and the relationship with my firstborn son. One single tactical error that every loving parent makes. And it is the exact mechanism that will leave you broke, alone, and dependent on a government that was never built to catch you. I'll give you that secret at the end, not before. You haven't earned it yet. I am 80 years old. My name is Ruth. Last Tuesday, I signed eviction papers against my own son. 55 years old, grown beard, tailored suits, standing in a luxury apartment that my money paid for every single month for over a decade. And when I tell you I didn't cry, I need you to understand that I had already done all the crying years ago, in silence, late at night, when I first started to suspect that the boy I raised had become something I never intended to build. I didn't raise a man. I raised a parasite. And the worst part, the part that kept me up staring at the ceiling for 600 nights before I made that call to my attorney, is that I was the one who fed him. Every dollar I gave Marcus was a spoonful of poison disguised as love, and I served it to him with a smile on a silver tray, because that is what mothers do when the world tells them that sacrifice is the highest form of devotion. The world lied. Sacrifice without strategy is just slow suicide. Let me set the scene so you understand the texture of my rage. I built my wealth in a country that told me, from the moment my mother pushed me into this world in a segregated ward in 1946, that I was not supposed to have anything. I watched the banks redline my father's neighborhood, watched the insurance companies deny my mother's claims, watched the school system funnel every child that looked like me into a pipeline that ended in either prison or minimum wage. And I beat it, not because I was lucky, not because someone gave me a chance, because I studied the system the way a prisoner studies the walls of the cell, not to admire them, but to find the crack. I became a real estate investor when black women in this country could barely get a checking account without a cosigner. I purchased my first property with money I saved, working 3 jobs for 9 years, sleeping 4 hours a night, eating rice and beans 5 days a week so I could afford to eat like a human being on the weekends. That property turned into 2, then 5, then a portfolio that made my accountant nervous because he had never seen a woman with my complexion hold that kind of paper. I built a fortress, brick by brick, insult by insult, rejection by rejection. And then I handed the keys to a man who used it to impress strangers at a golf club. Marcus came to me 3 days before the eviction, sitting in my library, drinking my tea, wearing a watch that costs more than most people's cars, and asked me for $20,000. Not for survival, not for his children's education, for networking, for access to a club where men with inherited money would shake his hand and pretend he was one of them. And while he was sipping and smiling, I had a report from my wealth manager sitting in my lap, that said, in cold numbers, that if I continued subsidizing Marcus's lifestyle, my principal, the money that keeps me out of a state-run facility, the money that ensures I die with dignity and not in a hallway with a government-issued blanket, would be critically compromised within 24 months. My son was drinking tea in my house, wearing my money on his wrist, asking me to accelerate my own financial death, and he didn't even blink. But before I show you how I dismantled the entire arrangement, you need to understand the lie they programmed into your bones. They told you that blood is thicker than water. They told you that a good mother never stops giving. They told you that if your child is 40, 50, 55 years old and still struggling, it is your failure, your burden, your cross. That is not love. That is a hostage situation with a family photo on the wall, and the system loves it. The financial industry in this country makes billions every year off elderly parents liquidating stable assets, real estate, index funds, retirement accounts, to pour cash into the unstable lifestyles of adult children who never learned to build because they never had to. Every dollar Marcus spent at that golf club, every European vacation his wife Janine booked on my credit, every tailored suit hanging in that closet was a brick pulled from my fortress and thrown into a fire. The system doesn't see a loving grandmother. It sees a liquidity event. It sees generational wealth, black generational wealth, the kind that was built against every odd this country could stack, being recycled back into consumption, back into the pockets of the same institutions that tried to keep us from accumulating it in the first place. When I gave Marcus money, I wasn't helping my family. I was completing a cycle of extraction that started before I was born. You want to know when I knew it was over? It wasn't the golf club request. It was 5 days later when Janine showed up at my door with my grandchildren. She had them dressed in their school uniforms, backpacks on, looking up at me with those big brown eyes, and she stood behind them like a general positioning shields on a battlefield. She said, "Ruth, the children need stability. They need to know their grandmother cares." Translation: give us the money or we'll make you feel like a monster in front of the people you love most in this world. She weaponized my grandchildren. She turned my blood into a bargaining chip. And when I looked at her face, I didn't see cruelty. I saw training. Janine learned that move because it had worked before. It worked every single time. Because every single time I folded, every single time I wrote the check, swallowed the resentment, and told myself it was for the kids. But that Tuesday, something in my spine locked into place, something ancestral, something that came from my grandmother, who picked cotton and still managed to hide coins in a jar under the floorboards because she understood that survival is not an emotion. It is an architecture, and you do not let anyone, not even your own blood, compromise the architecture. If you have ever been that parent, the one writing checks with shaking hands and a breaking heart, and you are done living on your knees for people who stand on your back, type strength in the comments right now, so I know I'm not talking to an empty room. I called my attorney. His name is Gerald, and he has worked with me for 22 years, and he is the only man outside of my late husband who has ever seen me cry. I told him I wanted Marcus out. Not next month, not next quarter, now. And I didn't just want him out of the apartment. I wanted the apartment removed from the equation entirely, so that there would be nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to beg for, nothing left to weaponize. Gerald and I structured a charitable lead trust. What that means, for those of you who don't speak legal, is that I transferred the ownership of that luxury apartment, the one I had been paying for, the one Marcus treated like his birthright, into a charitable foundation that funds financial literacy programs for young people in underserved neighborhoods in Atlanta. The apartment now belongs to the mission. If Marcus wants to live there, he pays rent to the foundation. Every dollar he spends on that apartment now teaches a 17-year-old in a zip code that the banks abandoned how to read a balance sheet. I turned his entitlement into someone else's education, and that is what power looks like when it is wielded by a woman who is done apologizing. But Marcus did not go quietly. They never do. He called me cruel. He called me heartless. He told me I was destroying the family. And then he reached for the sharpest weapon in his arsenal. You'll never see your grandchildren again. He said it with his jaw set, like a man who believed he was holding the winning hand. But I had already anticipated that move, because I have been watching this boy bluff since he was 12 years old, and he told me the dog ate his report card. I sent an email that same evening to both Marcus and Janine, copied to Gerald, informing them that the 529 college savings plans I established for my grandchildren, plans funded exclusively by me, controlled exclusively by me, named with me as the sole custodian, would be suspended immediately if any attempt was made to restrict my access to those children. Those funds are not part of the estate. They are not part of the inheritance. They are mine to direct. And I directed them with the precision of a woman who has spent 80 years learning that sentiment without structure is just a leash someone else holds. Now I need you to listen carefully, because this is where most people lose the lesson. They hear my story and they think it's about money. It is not about money. The money is the instrument, but the disease is deeper. The disease is the belief that your worth as a parent is measured by your willingness to bleed. That if you have resources and your child does not, the moral thing to do is transfer until you are equal, which in practice means transfer until you are empty and they are still unsatisfied. Because a person who has never built their own floor will never feel stable standing on yours. Marcus did not need $20,000. Marcus needed to feel the cold concrete under his feet. He needed to wake up at 4 a.m. with a knot in his stomach and no one to call. He needed to sit in the wreckage of his own choices without a net, without a check, without his mother's voice on the other end of the phone saying, "It's going to be okay." Because the only way a 55-year-old man becomes an actual man is if the world is allowed to do what it does: crush you, reshape you, force you to find your own spine. I robbed him of that. For decades, I robbed my son of the only education that matters, the education of consequence. And I need to talk about what this does to a body. Not his body, mine. When you carry the weight of a grown adult's life on your shoulders for 10, 15, 20 years while pretending everything is fine, the stress does not just live in your mind. It colonizes your cells. My doctor told me 2 years ago that my cortisol levels were consistent with someone in a combat zone. I am an 80-year-old woman living in a beautiful home with original art on the walls and organic food in the refrigerator, and my body thought it was at war, because it was. Every phone call from Marcus was a grenade. Every visit from Janine was an ambush. Every dinner with the grandchildren was a minefield where one wrong word could trigger an explosion of guilt and accusation. The system of dependency I created wasn't just bankrupting my portfolio. It was eating my heart muscle. It was thinning my bones. It was clouding my cognition at the exact age when I need every neuron firing to protect myself from a world that sees an elderly black woman as either an ATM or an inconvenience. Let me tell you something about aging while black in this country that the wellness influencers will never post. The system has 2 modes for us. When you are young and strong, it extracts your labor. When you are old and accumulated, it extracts your wealth. The mechanism changes, but the direction of flow is always the same, out of your hands, into theirs. And theirs doesn't always mean strangers. Sometimes theirs is sitting at your Thanksgiving table, calling you mom, and asking if you've updated your will lately. The ageism that Marcus deployed against me was surgical. He brought a doctor into the equation, a man named Dr. Thorne, a geriatrician who smiled too much and agreed too easily that I seemed overwhelmed by financial management. Marcus wanted me to sign over the oversight of my accounts. He dressed it up as concern. Mom, you shouldn't have to worry about all these numbers at your age. But I heard the real sentence underneath. Your mind is going, and we need to get to the safe before you notice. That is how fortresses fall, not through assault, but through the slow, smiling suggestion that you are too old, too tired, too fragile to guard your own walls. And the moment you agree, the moment you hand over the passwords and the power of attorney because your child made you feel like a burden for being competent, you become a tenant in your own life. After the eviction, after the trust was established, after the emails were sent and the lawyers had done their work, I sat alone in my living room for a long time. The house was quiet. There was no phone ringing, no one asking for anything, no performance of family love that was really just a transaction in disguise. And in that silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt my own pulse. Not the anxious racing rhythm of a woman managing everyone else's catastrophe. A slow, steady beat. The rhythm of a woman who had finally chosen herself. Not out of selfishness, out of survival. Because if I go down, if my money runs out, if my health collapses, if my mind fades because I spent the last years of my life hemorrhaging resources into a grown man's fantasy, there is no one coming to save me. The government will put me in a facility with fluorescent lights and institutional food, and Marcus will visit once a month with flowers and guilt, and Janine will tell the grandchildren that Grandma is resting, and my entire legacy, every property I bought, every wall I built against a system designed to keep me small, will evaporate into someone else's consumption. That is the future I was walking toward, and I turned around. Now here is the secret I promised you, the one that cost me $1.2 million to learn. The master error the one every parent who loves too much eventually makes, is this: you confused financial rescue with emotional connection. Every check you wrote was not an act of love, it was an act of fear. You were afraid that if you stopped giving, they would stop needing you. And if they stopped needing you, they would stop loving you. And if they stopped loving you, you would die alone. That fear is the real parasite, not your child, the fear. And the system knows it. The banks know it. The financial advisors know it. The culture knows it. They all count on your terror of abandonment to keep the money flowing downhill, from the old to the young, from the built to the unbuilt, from the fortress into the fire. The moment you sever the equation, the moment you understand that your child's love is not a subscription service that requires monthly payment, you become untouchable. You become the thing they never wanted you to be, free. Marcus hasn't spoken to me in 4 months. The silence hurts in a place that medicine cannot reach. But I sleep through the night now. My blood pressure has dropped 14 points. My accountant tells me my reserves are recovering. And somewhere in Atlanta, a young girl from a neighborhood the banks forgot is learning how to read a financial statement because my apartment is funding her education instead of my son's ego. That is what legacy looks like. Not a check written in guilt, a structure built in clarity. If you are sitting where I sat 6 months ago, terrified, bleeding money, being emotionally blackmailed by people who share your last name, hear me. You are not cruel for choosing yourself. You are not a bad mother for closing the vault. You are a general protecting the fortress that generations after you will need to survive. Build the wall. Change the locks. Let them call you heartless. A beating heart inside a bankrupt body is still a dead woman walking. Save yourself first, because nobody else will. And if this reached the place inside you that has been screaming for permission, type legacy in the comments so the next woman behind you knows she is not insane for wanting to survive. You are not insane. You are awake. Now act like it.